You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I sat down with Lieutenant General Brian Robinson, the commander of Air Education and Training Command, and Lieutenant General Andrea Tullos, the commander and president of Air University. We had a fascinating conversation on the intersection of training and readiness, and I hope you enjoy listening to the conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. You two both run major institutions in the Air Force charged with training and education, and that obviously has a big tie-in with readiness. Something we're thinking a lot about, especially as we gear up for great power competition. We're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. We're getting ready for a possible scenario with China that we all hope doesn't happen. But what's the role for training and education in all of this?
I think the role for Air Education Training Command writ large as a whole, we also call ourselves the first command because we have the formal responsibility to attract, recruit, train, and educate all the airmen for the United States Air Force. So in that way, and what you talked about, in addition to attracting and recruiting and finding the right quality and capable people that have the potentiality to serve and develop into airmen, it's the formal education and training of those airmen in those ways that they are ready to go out to the great power competition and serve in the ways that the history has shown that they can.
At Air University, we really just have a slice of General Robinson's enterprise, but we like to think it's an extremely powerful slice. We try and fight above our weight. We're really trying to get after the mentality, that warrior mindset. Once the accession units have sort of set the foundation, we're going to take the airmen that come to us from across the entire operational Air Force and just pour into them. So it's get them to think critically, get them to have the confidence they need to operate under the conditions that we believe they're going to face, whether it's tomorrow, a couple of years from now, or even decades from now, and then send them back to their units better. So better leaders, better practitioners, and steeped in the art and science of air power.
What I'd add on to that is, as well as I actually consider Air University the center of mass, particularly from the cognitive development and experientiality for making those airmen ready for great power competition. So they are a huge piece of that. Where we need to do better, I think I would say, is with the civilian portion in terms of that education and training. There's a lot of factors, I think, that come into play for that, but we certainly have, we don't have it perfect with regard to the uniform members either, but we are a lot more further advanced and I think more comprehensive in that space.
And AETC is based in San Antonio. Air University is based in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. But you also both oversee facilities and airmen far beyond that. So how big is this global footprint?
From the training perspective, we have field training detachments where we teach technical skills at a variety of different disciplines throughout the world, all the way to Japan and into Europe as well.
We give you over 1,000 locations just from AU. So, we count our 145 ROTC detachments. We've got 870 junior ROTC detachments. And then we have a footprint which extends into all of our installations through our curriculum. So our airman leadership schools. And we've got AFIT up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and pieces of the nuclear enterprise. I think sometimes we forget we're also embedded in our sister services. So we have air practitioners that are at the war colleges for the other universities. So we like to think that we have a global reach. We say we have over 600,000 airmen enrolled, and that doesn't include the civilians. So, if you're wearing an Air Force uniform or you work for the Air Force, we consider you enrolled in Air University, and there's opportunities for us to make you better.
Very broadly speaking, how would you each characterize the state of education and training in the Air Force? Where are things going very well? Where are things moving in the right direction? And where do we still need to see improvements?
So I think we're really energized, and that's great to see. I think what we've done right is we have pivoted our curriculum really quickly to what our leadership have said we need to be focused on, which is really getting the practitioners to be able to operate at speed, our commanders and staff officers to be prepared for the uncertainty that's out there. I think where we need to do more work is we are trying to dramatically improve what we used to consider our distance learning. We used to call it the box of books. The 80% of our Air Force that doesn't have the opportunity to come to us and sit in our classrooms, the brick and mortar style classrooms. The world of blended learning and distance learning has changed dramatically. And so we're working really hard to leverage not just the technology that's out there, but the instructors who are comfortable delivering instruction over a screen so that we can reach our airmen where they are, whether they're overseas, whether they're guardsmen or reservists, the guardians that are out there, and to teach in a manner that they've grown up. This generation has grown up with an iPhone in their hand. They're very used to being on the internet and doing things through apps. And so our focus for the next couple of years will be to get after that 80%. Those are still 80% of the airmen that are going to have to fight a fight if it comes our way. And so we owe them a little better. And so we're working hard on that.
With regard to training, we're in a very similar space with that in terms of how we are training with more intent and purpose, as well as, I like to call it the right dose at the right time. There's I think a finite amount of bandwidth and or frankly care or concern at certain portions of your developmental path. But we figured out or have worked hard and are figuring out how to sprinkle the right dose in at the right time to give them folks a taste of that. But much more formal, much more driven by purpose, aligned to the competencies that we have. And we really just break it down to what are the competencies we want our airmen to have to be competent, credible, capable, and confident when they go out into the operational space from that perspective. And the training gets to more of the practicum, as I like to think about it, as opposed to the academic or the theoretical. So how do they take what they've learned in the formal education and then put it into practice from that perspective? So one example of the right dose at the right time would be PACER Forge, basic military training. By the way, that stands for Primary Agile Combat Employment Range or Operations Readiness Generation Exercise.
PACER Forge is way snappier, so whoever came up with that, that's good.
Yeah, that would be Colonel Corshane and the team from 2nd Air Force and 37th Training Wing. But what they do is, after going through about 6 weeks of conforming and learning how to be an airman and working together as units, teamwork's certainly a focus on that. They get given a series of vignettes and scenarios to solve as a team through teamwork, communication, leadership. In a sandbox where we used to do the previous exercise there, it was called the Beast. 36 hours, they have to solve it on their own. The MTIs, military training instructors, fall back into more of a risk managers, coaches, facilitators. So this is the one they have to start to understand who's got strengths and what weaknesses and the problem that they have to solve, with not a lot of written guidance on how to solve it. So that's one aspect of just before they step off into tech school that they understand, here's kind of a taste of what the Air Force is going to be like when you step out into the operational and when you get through your advanced and initial skills training.
I want to unpack that a little bit. And one of the things that sets the U.S. military apart is an empowered, well-trained NCO Corps. What is the balance, especially through the lens of training, education, and readiness? What is the balance between making sure that NCO Corps is trained according to doctrine, knows the doctrine, but is also set up for success in terms of taking initiative and taking action when doctrine might not speak to that person's individual problem?
I think doctrine is necessary to sort of set the boundaries and the frameworks. It kind of gets at the why and what we should train for in that way and how we can expect to carry out. And it serves as an aligning, I think, factor in what we do. But at the same time, the experientialities that we have at the tactical level, we understand through history that the circumstances in the operational environment, the tactical environment will change. No plan survives initial contact with the enemy is one of the adages that you hear, or every plan is just a point of departure. But everyone's galvanized with that. And then from operations, you're empowered, entrusted, and experienced for how to make decisions to adapt to the situation. So I think that's the balance that's there. That's been, I think, the lifeblood of the U.S. military throughout its history is we've had that agility and expectation and that trust and empowerment.
I think the empowerment is important. I think our technical competence is what sets the foundation along with our good order and discipline. So unit cohesion is built off of trust. And I think the skills that we give our airmen before they're NCOs, we immediately start pouring leadership into them. And so that they learn how to become followers, they're accountable to themselves and they're accountable to their teammates. Connecting them to the mission and giving them a mission set that they're inspired about, cultivating their air-mindedness and just their intense curiosity and wanting to learn more, and then turning them loose and letting them understand that if they make a mistake, we've got their back, right? And that letting them try to do something that perhaps they haven't done before in a manner that's safe, and in a manner where they can learn for it and overcome. I think the Air Force has, in all of its heritage and tradition, been the ones who are the most willing to, I'll call it break glass, and to try things a little differently. We find ourselves sometimes embedded in other organizations where there's just a handful of people that have to advocate for the air power and that are going to have to come up with a creative solution when there isn't one. We're not necessarily going to be able to just use more force or throw more manpower at it. So we got to think our way through problems. And our airmen are unbelievably educated right now. They come to us with just an amazing diversity of skill sets and backgrounds. And it's great to see what they can do when you just turn them loose.
If I could, an example in history in World War II, the transition from strategic bombing to skip bombing in the Pacific Theater in and around Australia and Port Moresby, right? So General Kennedy and his forces found out through that experience that they were not having great success with the traditional Norden bomb site bombing tactics, techniques, and procedures. So they came up with a way to do skip bombing where you approached a wave top run at a Japanese naval vessel and convoy and just launched the bomb across the waves, and it skipped across to defeat the enemy air defenses that the Navy could present to them in the losses. And in the end, they tested it out there, belief in the concept. And in the end, the history proved out that they destroyed an entire Japanese naval convoy with that adjustment.
How does this connect to agile learning?
I go back to meeting the airmen where they are. So agile learning for us is first about breaking down the curriculum into blocks that an airman can take depending on their circumstances. So if you're that airman that's getting sent overseas for the first time and you're going to be in the European theater, maybe working on a NATO staff, you probably want to take our strategic studies block of Air Command and Staff College first, because you're not going to be a squadron commander, you're not going to be a DO, you're going to be integrated in a team of staff officers. And so we can make that available to you. And you can choose to take the leadership block on your way out when you are going to be a DO. And you're headed back to an Air Force unit to lead somewhere between 120, could be up to 200 airmen. And you want those leadership skills fresh. And so that's the agility that we're looking for when it comes to our content and to giving the airmen the option of not having to wait until, I hate seeing in the critiques, I'd wish I'd had this sooner. Because to me, that just says, why didn't you? Like, how can we let you have it sooner? Because some of the things maybe can wait till later, and so we'll get there. We're gonna be piloting that through this year, and see how agile we can get.
Those tools are exactly what we're after, even in the training side. So it's we like to call it on command, on demand. But so far, even to the extent that a couple of things we're looking at in the pipeline is a time to step away from the move through the pipeline as a class model. In other words, the amount of time dedicated for a particular course is generally built on a statistic model that's a bell curve. And so you'll have some portion of those airmen that will meet the competencies well before the allotted time. But right now, by and large, we hold them in place, particularly in our pilot training pipelines. They'll be held in place until the class meets its graduation date. And I think it's important, and General Tullos and I have talked about this before, and we heard it this morning, quite frankly, from General Speedy Martin in his comments this morning. You will never forget the bonds of the first operational squadron that you go to the fight with. That is where you're going to form your core connections and relationships and form really the core of the crux of your resilience. So the longer we delay somebody from getting out to their operational unit, the less I think we're doing them a bit of a disservice from letting them get into the force. To their squadron, it's got a mission and essential purpose and a group of people that they're actually going to form lifelong bonds with. Not that you won't bond with people in your formal training, but I think those relationships are transactional mostly because you're only there for a finite amount of weeks or months.
You mentioned Pacer Forge earlier. There's another forge, right, called Bracer Forge. Could you tell us about that?
Bracer Forge is under development right now. It's meant to be at the tech school level. So think going to Shepherd Air Force Base or to Keesler, where you now have airmen that are getting steeped in their particular AFSCs, and it's about more focused on agile combat employment and multi-capable airmen together, where you have some knowledge of your civil engineering background, defender background, cyber background, and you come together again, a problem-solving scenario for how to generate a force, generate combat air power to provide effects from that location. You've got quite a bit more assets that you can work with that are more real-world, think aircraft mock-ups or tools that you can use. That's the next dose while they're at initial skills training, at least on the enlisted side.
And for those listeners interested in more on simulations and training specifically, this was a big topic of our last conversation, General Robinson, almost a year ago now, which is hard to believe.
Yep.
General Tullos, you've overseen some pretty big changes to officer training. So tell me about OTS Victory.
OTS Victory, I will say, was probably our most significant, I would say, positive fallout of a lot of innovation from last year. That is the biggest surprise, right? So we went into the year thinking that we were going to focus on our Air Force ROTC overhaul. And we kind of got backed in a corner on officer training school, where we looked at our production model and the instructor cadre that we had. And I was really dissatisfied with the fact that we were kind of running them into the ground and we weren't giving them the professional development that I think a tour down there deserves. And so we went to the commander, Colonel Bailey, down there and said, look, take 5 or 10 people, lock them in a room and just wipe the whiteboard off, put money aside, put manpower aside. If I told you you had to produce this number of officer trainees next year, how would you do it? And literally, they came back in a couple weeks, and this I've never seen this before in my career. And from what they had scratched out on the whiteboard, we looked at it first and said, "Why aren't we already doing this?" Right? And then second, got it through General Robinson up to General Brown as the chief of staff, and with an order back from him to go, like run hard, in less than 60 days. And so we went from a concept that was early this spring, and they're going to be in execution on October 10th. And so they've been working really hard to reset what we're doing. So what is it? Why OTS Victory? So first of all, it does exactly what I think the secretary said yesterday, that we have to be prepared if it comes for a wartime construct. And this places us into a wartime construct where if on our worst day we did have to surge, we wouldn't have to change how we're forging officers. I wouldn't have to completely rebuild the pipeline. I would just say go. The second thing that I think the most important aspect is we're bringing back a leader-follower construct that allows the trainees who are so officer training school is civilians. They don't have a military background. There's a handful of prior enlisted, but for the most part, we're taking people who aren't already exposed to military service and forging them into an officer. And it allows them to get sets and reps. It allows them to be a follower for the first portion of the course, and then it incrementally places them into leadership situations where they're responsible for delivering some of the education and training and setting the foundation. It's largely cultural. It's core values first. It's an introduction to our heritage, and it's an introduction to that critical thinking that we know we need. I mean, these are all individuals who have a college bachelor's degree, and some of them have much more than that. We have people that show up with master's degrees, PhDs. There are medical practitioners who are going through medical school. And so
PhDs cause problems. You should just weed them out.
We need a few of those, but we need them to practice, right? So I'm really, really proud of the team down there. And, again, I hope you get to come down there later. And I want to get that team behind the mic and let them tell their story, because it's a great story.
There isn't a lot of thinking about what do we need to change now. So if a war starts, which we all hope doesn't happen, hopefully we successfully deter any adversary. But if a war starts, we don't have to all of a sudden change everything while we're trying to fly that plane. And I think we see that mostly in the industrial base and how the Defense Department works as a customer and its relationship with industry and supply lines and all these different things. And it's good to see that happening in training. And I want to see a lot more of that, because I think Ukraine is exposed in some ways how unready we are for some sort of major contingency.
That's one of my objectives as well with the transformation to the tech training transformation approach with Second Air Force and tech training skills and pipelines and pathways, is to figure out what right looks like now so we can do it equal to or better quality faster, because the demand signal, if we get into that fight, is going to come. And to your point, we don't want to have to revamp the entire thing. So what was done at OTS Victory really paved the way. And it really was the other piece to our point about a clean board was, because typically what people will come to you is just pour more money or more people, for example, are the two things that we tend to be lacking a lot to the situation, as opposed to how could we do this differently? That doesn't dismiss outright those other two consequential resource inputs, but let's figure out what we can do with what we have, or to a certain level at the acceptable level of risk, and then does that improve the situation not only for us, for Air University, ATC, but for the rest of the Air Force?
Now, about half of our normal readers and listeners have a military background of some sort. But for the other half, changing this is a really big deal. And it is encouraging and also very surprising that it happened in such short order. So congratulations on that. If you're successful and if the people who come after you are successful, how would you like to see the training and education enterprise look different, let's say 5 to 10 years from now, compared to what it looks like right now?
So I think one of the major factors I would say in that is, I kind of already described it, hey, it's about getting people through and getting them onto their mission, as opposed to the way we do it today. Lots of valid or real reasons to why we are where we are with the pace of throughput today. But I think getting them the right quality training in a way that they're already attuned and accustomed to learning as it is, allow that to happen. There is a nexus between training and education. It's what competencies are we looking for, who can deliver them, at what dose, when, so that it's relevant to the member and throughout their development. There's nothing worse than giving somebody a dose of something when their care factor is low or their bandwidth just isn't there to consume it. So One example would be a young man or woman in pilot training, initial skills training, would not really be interested too much in the pacer forge aspect, right? They're trying to master how to fly that airplane and get their wings. But when they get to the FTU, the FTUs, formal training units, the F-35s, for example, are doing ACE exercises as part of their syllabi, where they're going away from their main bases and getting them some exposure there. So they're already in their weapon system now, those kind of things. So I would want to see it much more integrated. I think are we organized right for great power competition? I think we have to have the right, AETC has to have the right, I would say, ownership and influence on the processes that drive force development, that are key in force development. Right now, it's fairly bifurcated or fractured in a lot of ways.
Translate force development into sort of a 101 version of that a newbie to the topic might understand.
Generally, what it is, it's about how we take someone who doesn't know anything about the military and put them on a path where they develop at the right time and experience level to gain skills and competencies, to become more confident and assume greater roles and responsibilities as they move and progress, to allow them to be in charge of operations and be flight chiefs and operations officers and leaders in those roles, and understand how to read a situation when it's about leadership or followership based on the circumstances that are there. And I think that's, how do we progress them through their career? And then lastly, how do we document that they had those experiences so that we know in our formation, we have, to use General Saltzman's example this morning, we've got 4 super coders who actually have the skills to do this, and we don't have to go find a contractual solution or that's going to take, or an inordinate amount of time to rely on some other entity, another portion of the Air Force to achieve that.
We're a little overeducated right now and a little undertrained. And why I say that is training the day after you have it, you start to lose a little bit of proficiency. So our youngest airmen, if they're in their first term, we're really just trying to get them proficient in their foundational basic skills. But the people who choose to stay with us and they make non-commissioned officer or the company grade officers, you're as steeped as you're going to be in your whatever your Air Force specialty is at captain. And then we're going to start piling on leadership and all these other things that make it very hard to stay at that level of proficiency for the rest of your career. So it's kind of this sliding back and forth. So we want to make sure that we're pouring the right material into you, which I always say leadership first. I got to get the leadership right throughout your career. And so it requires sets and reps and touch points. And then you balance that out with the education. I think what I would say our measure of success would be, so what would nirvana look like? So we exist for professional military education, like by law. That's what makes us different from other universities. And we are building practitioners, all of them. They all have a job. They're all on scholarship. They're going to go out there and practice. What I'd like to see is that we have the content so right and the experience so positive that everybody wants to do it, whether you're in the Guard, Reserve, active duty, because when you get up in the morning, it's going to make you better at your job. And it's not going to force you to make those life decisions where I'm going to spend 10 hours on Sunday in Starbucks instead of being with my family so that I can do my reading and my homework. We've figured that out so that you can pour into yourself and not feel like you're giving up opportunities that are they're time bound in life. Like go see your kid's soccer game because you know that when you're at work tomorrow, you're going to have that 30 minutes to get into the system and make yourself better. And so I'd like to see 10 years from now where everybody's doing their intermediate developmental education and everyone's doing their senior developmental education because they believe that it's going to make them better every day. It's not something that someone's just going to look at on a promotion board or when they're trying to hire you for the next job. That's success.
The one resource we actually do control probably greater than any other is time, right? So we have to set aside the time for the airmen and their supervisors to figure out, we're going to train to this particular task for this reason, for how long, and go through it, debrief it. We often learn best by failure. So it's okay to have a scenario that it's the Kobayashi Maru scenario for that particular function or that particular unit. They know where all the minefields, the mines are that they're likely not to reveal and overcome. But you can then debrief it and unpack it. And those members in that unit is better because of that. I talked a little bit yesterday about, hey, what do we think it looks like to try to fight to get to the fight? That's one of the 6 fights, right? In a contested all-domain environment to launch from Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, right? Let's not assume that we get to do what we want when we want to and not contested in some way or shape or form. We have to not underestimate or underappreciate anything that the adversary can throw at us. And we tend to, one of my experiences has been, unless we see offensive capability value to a particular thing, let's say UAVs, for example, right now, we will tend to dismiss it from largely a sort of a David and Goliath, but we're Goliath, right? But David, who's got to find another way, is coming up with a sling. And so we have to really work hard to see the value in any particular function or capability and how that can even turn the tide of a battle or turn the tide of a campaign, and not dismiss it right out of hand because it's not an F-35 or an equivalent to that weapon system, for example.
I'd like to go back to something you said about, the value of the leadership. So I have a lot of conversations right now where we're trying to get curriculum. I say, hey, we have to get the leadership right first. That's very hard to measure when something's not going wrong, right? So I don't know who invented the skip bomb tactics, right? But what was that person doing the day before? And was that the person you had on your first round draft pick? I want them on my team, right? How did we figure out that they were, going to be that fulcrum? And so I've had people say, hey, I'd love to do that, but we can't afford it. When I talk about leadership being tactile, and if we do nothing else, I can't do leadership training all virtually. I need you to they need to be in a group. I need to observe it. They need to feel it. It needs to be physical. They'll say, I can't afford it. I said, you can't afford not to do it. You cannot afford to not do it. So those are just choices. We have to be able to make that choice. Time is money, right? I need 3 days. Like, what's less important than that? If you give me 3 days, I can get you the outcomes at whatever echelon of leadership you're talking about. And I believe that we can't not afford to do it. So it has to be a priority. Or we don't know where that airman could be in your formation and you don't know who it is or what they're capable of doing.
Well, this part of the discussion leads very well into my next question. Regular readers of War on the Rocks and listeners to the podcast know that I'm a big fan of Cathal Nolan's book, The Allure of Battle. And I actually would go so far as to say it's the most important book written on military affairs in the last decade. And his central argument is that wars between large powers are not decided by battles. We focus a lot on battles as being decisive, but they're actually decided by which country, which belligerent is able to stay in the fight the longest, financially, politically supply itself, and continue to generate force when they need it. And with that in mind, what needs to change, or what are we already doing when it comes to training specifically? How do you train for that kind of a thing?
So that's a great question, and I appreciate you recommending the book. I haven't had the time since we last talked to actually read it, but I've actually purchased it. So I think these are things that really force us to think, right? In my experience, and I have not earned the right and the mantle to be on the cadre at Air University. Great respect for what they do, so I'm probably going to go out on a limb here a little bit. But if you look back at the great power conflicts, right, battles should comprise multiple events inside of an overall campaign. And the campaign should be set by military or political objectives, thus that translate to military objectives to allow those to be successful. But if you look at particularly World War II in the European theater, it was about forcing Germany to culminate, right? There's a reason why we went after bombing the ball-bearing factories. There's a reason why the strafing campaign, again, another adaptation that was made by 8th Air Force in that theater, where after the bomber formations were back beyond safe range to be encroached by or attacked by the Luftwaffe, the guidance was targets of opportunity, strafe airfields, dispersed airfields on the ground, empty your ammunition on aircraft that are on the deck, not flying, that are in parking on the aprons. And again, that forced the Luftwaffe to culminate in early as an air force and not be a credible air force, which set the day for Normandy, or helped set the effects for Normandy, those kind of things. So the challenge is we are not in a position these days, I think, in warfare of recent times to, I would say, the battle of annihilation and complete ultimate surrender, right? We bombed Germany. The United States took Germany and Japan both to the point where they couldn't fight anymore as a nation, but they broke the national will, the logistics ability to provide and generate forces and field a military, basically. So I think there's something to that. I haven't read the book in total, but I think there is something. The battles, they're easy to count. The activity that goes with them. The outcomes are much harder to measure, but then how does it align with where are we at in the campaign's progression toward the objectives?
Yeah, so here's where I have had some exposure to the book, and I'm not sold on the premise.
You can say you don't like the book. It's fine.
No, it's not that I don't like the book, but so here's what I think matters. I think the American experience is uniquely different when you look at our system of government and what we as uniformed personnel actually control. So what I would say, I don't dispute the argument in the book, but it simply doesn't apply to my case because I have to train and educate as if the full spectrum of conflict could happen tomorrow. And the rest of our government has a huge role in logistics, national will. How do we train our population? Like, what is the psychology? If the population just says, hey, we're not interested in this, the politicians aren't going to go there. Like, we've seen that happen historically. We don't get to choose the day that we fight, what the fight's going to look like. I mean, you can look at Ukraine right now, right? It could be that much of a slog. I think what is different today is technology has given militaries, which were already hugely expensive. Nations have collapsed their national treasure on conflict at low end. At high end, you could just flat run out of ammo and you're done. And the weaponry can actually outperform the logistics space.
Well, that's part of his argument is the logistics. And Ukraine's a great example. Maintaining this logistics system for years is quite the task.
Right. I just think for the uniformed personnel, it doesn't alleviate our need to be prepared for what if it doesn't. Right. We still have to calculate that full range. Yeah. And so having everyone mentally ready, physically ready, cognitively ready for that full spectrum. And then we don't know where the chips fall.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so I think to your point about the logistics, I think that's both valid. And so we've heard this, I think, in recent times where the United States military, particularly Air Force, is designed right now, since Desert Storm, is funded, designed, and built around efficiency. How can we maintain at a sustainable pace the rotation of forces in the CENTCOM theater? And now we're realizing we have to be designed with some level of effectiveness. And so that costs money. So how much, even just in the size of the Army, generally speaking, in the constitutional perspective, is the Congress willing to raise and fund? There's lots to unpack in that, but it comes down to, do we see that as a necessary function? Our job is to be ready with whatever tools and resources we're given, and for the fight that we see could be, plan for the worst, hope for the best is one adage. But I liken a lot of this to fire departments in any municipal district. People spend, where they can afford it, large cities, good money to field a very capable fire department, by the way, which they hope they don't use, right? But when the alarm sounds, they've deliberately said, I want the firehouses in these locations for a certain amount of response time, either as an individual firehouse or to aggregate. We spend a lot of time training them, but we hope that we actually never use them. But our job is that part of that fire department for the nation and the United States military is to be ready when the call comes. The question is not an argument, but we're subject to, we get the resources we get, and then we have to do our best in all ways that we can to manage those resources so we are as ready as possible when it happens.
A great analogy, because I love the fact that what came into my head also is at the same time that the fire department's training to save the people from the burning building, they're also getting the cat out of the tree, right? And so you're like, how'd you get the mission to getting the cat out of the tree from saving the people from the building? And our military does that too, right? So we are a values-based military. We are going to be on the right side of right. And at some point, someone decided getting the cat out of the tree is actually important. It shows that we are not just the call us when you need something broken or killed. It's call us when you need, we're standing by when people have earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, to save lives, in addition to doing what our nation asks us to do on our worst day. And so it would be easier when you're an autocracy and something goes wrong, look, you just make a decision and you're told and you move out. You're seeing a little bit of that in Russia. But we have always said, look, we might get punched first, right? We might take a punch because we're going to stay on the right side of the right, which is why I think we start with our core values. We're going to teach people who we are before we teach you what you're going to do.
It's already come up a couple times in this conversation. Both of you as leaders use and employ history a lot as a tool, as a resource. I'd love you both to talk about that.
History is a powerful tool because most of the airmen in the Air Force today have not seen significant conflict. Every day is another day further away, even from the height of the conflict in Iraq in 2006 to 2008. We're almost 20 years from that. 9/11, a lot of people weren't even born that are coming into the Air Force, right? So the history, I think, is important to fall back on to say, hey, we, the United States military, our forefathers and foremothers, forebearers have done this before. And to look at the circumstances that they were presented with and how they chose in that particular character of war to overcome those. And we don't have to necessarily go all the way back to World War II. The value in that is that's the last great power conflict that we saw. But there are more recent examples. The Operations Allies Refuge is one. The January 2020 Iran ballistic missile attack in CENTCOM, right? Where another example where ballistic missiles launched down to some of our forward operating bases there, and those folks had to figure out that were stationed there how to move quickly and disaggregate to minimize damaging effects. So there's lots of recent history there as well, just not necessarily at the scale of great power conflict. But in that space, I think I just described, even with Iran, that's a competition space, right, that had a little bit of a kinetic aspect to it at that time. So I think that's why it's important to force us to stop and think about, this is not new. The character of war is new, and we ought to be very critical thinking about how we put the new technologies and new approaches to warfare, the limitations and constraints in this environment to use, and how we work with those. But that's why I think it's important, but I also defer to General Tullos.
Yeah, it's huge for me. I mean, this is about culture, and I think culture goes back actually farther than the Air Force. We go back to our Air Force roots, but I think it goes all the way back to our founding fathers and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think we have always been a force for what is right. We're rules-based. We're about international law. And I think there's a lot of sports analogies that we like to use, but I'll say it's different in this way also, because if you're on the football field, both teams are playing by the same set of rules. And there's referees out there that'll throw the flag if someone violates the rules. We know we're not going to go into a fair fight. We might be fighting against whether it's a state actor or a non-state actor that's simply not going to follow the rules. But we will, regardless, in the face of that. We might be criticized for it in some cases, but we are going to take the high ground. That's a very difficult position to instill in everyone. And I think to do it, you have to go back to, this is the way it has been done generationally. This is our grandparents and our parents before us served. And at the end of the day, people want to uphold the honor of their family name and their community. And they're very tied to wherever it is they came from and whatever family they had and the values that were instilled to them in day one. And I think we take those values and we layer the Air Force Corps values on top of them. We don't just throw them out at the door. So it's huge for us. So almost everything we have, the symbology, the heritage, the museums. Air University is really one big museum. Everything from walking around the campus to going into the buildings. And so it's a huge part of what our mission set is. What
are some books that have made a big impression on you? Would love to hear your book recommendations.
Because I had an extra day, in airports on the way, I literally just finished The River of Doubt, which is not a recent book. So I like biographies. Mm-hmm. And I have to intersperse my personal reading with my professional reading because some of it's a little dry. But it's Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, how can you not get inspired by some of the things that he did? This was not principally as a president. So I don't know how I missed this, but I'd heard all about his African safaris. I had not heard about his exploration of the Amazon, which was absolutely fascinating. So if you want to study resiliency and how leaders team build and how teams go through adversity, it's a fantastic read.
He almost died down there, didn't he?
Yeah, multiple times. I mean, he had a son with him. Yeah, I mean, it was a train wreck of an expedition when you think of the logistics. Multiple people got fired on the way. But I mean, I had a knot in my stomach in the beginning of the book because you could just see the planning not going well. And I was like, oh yeah, this is going to end badly. That decision right there, not good. And so sure at all, but they made it back. But it is truly a testament to sort of what's been in our DNA, that we're explorers. He was intensely curious, and he was really, I think, one of our first. Well, I guess you could argue Jefferson was also, in that he sponsored a lot of exploration, but he did it himself. He went out and literally was capturing new species and bringing them back to museums. And I'm and a voracious reader, unbelievable how much he could read. So he was intensely curious.
I've drawn a lot from 2034, that fictional account of, what happens with China. The current book I'm reading right now is not so much about really, really deep thinking, but it's about, I would call it prioritization, and it's called Making Time for Strategy. So how do we as senior leaders not find ourselves beholden to the daily grind of the calendar and take time to sit down and frankly do things like this, where we just think about, leverage our curiosity and look back on assessing where we are as an organization in our development, and what it is that we need to work on next. Because if you don't fight for that time to do strategic thinking, you will get consumed and not have and you just start working 5 meter target to 5 meter target and not having the long view in mind.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Do not forget to check out our membership program. Big changes are afoot. Check it out at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.